everybody. Nice to see various of you now that I see on the screen that are friends, and I've seen you in others of these classes. Lori remarked at the beginning that the topic of this class seemed different from the other classes, and I assume that's because it does focus on couple relationship, but you know, the way that I think of the couple is that I think of human consciousness as being dyadic, that we can't really establish a sense of who we are without having an other. So it's an I am, you are kind of consciousness. It's not just I am. And because of that, then that couple or the dyad occurs again and again in many different contexts of our lives, you know, first with a parent, with siblings, with friends, and then partners, and then our grown children, and then the others that come through our lives that help us find out who we are. So I don't think of the couple as being typically or exclusively an intimate couple. However, on the other side of the coin, an intimate couple is a real mystery and not a picnic on the grass. So I'm happy to answer questions about intimate couples because it's where I spend a lot of my clinical time, and also a lot of my own consternation and so on is about how does that work, that people can trust each other when they come from different tribes. Typically, you know, at least in North America, we don't have arranged marriages here unless people come from other cultures and other countries. So typically we have, you know, we're coming into intimate relationship with somebody who's a stranger, not a complete stranger, but sometimes pretty much of a stranger. And then we're going to find out how are we going to trust each other. So I want to say some things first about trust, then about the kinds of issues that I find people present to me when they come for dialogue therapy. And those people might be, you know, a grown child and a parent. They might be siblings, or most often they are people who are in intimate relationships. So I will be talking about all different kinds of couples, but again, keeping in mind that the dyad, from my point of view, is the unit of consciousness. So the idea of trust, from, again, if you think of trust just in a general sense of you know, like we have financial trusts and we have places that we stand that are called trust. And then we have also the verb to trust. It seems to have something to do with feeling solid or grounded, feeling like there's a place to stand and it will survive that place to stand. And of course, because we know that the world actually is imperfect and impermanent and impersonal, it's kind of an illusion, trust is, but we need it to invest in almost anything, whether it's financial or it's relational. So we'll consider trust a place to stand that gives us the illusion of solidness or security or some kind of stability. And it depends on a number of things in my view. One is a kind of moral fabric, and that would mean that we have some kind of commitment to not killing, not stealing, and not lying, and perhaps also using sexuality in a way that doesn't involve lying. So the idea of trust depends on being able to trust both ourselves, and I think fundamentally ourselves, and then to trust somebody else. And there may be some rules connected to trust, connected to this kind of ongoing stability. And again, an illusion of stability. So I believe that truth-telling gives oneself a very stable sense of trust. If you trust yourself to, generally speaking, tell the truth, then you don't have to tell different kinds of stories on different occasions. You don't have a lot of anxiety about whether you've told one person one thing and another person another thing. So it gives you a feeling of freedom if you trust yourself to speak the truth. The other thing about speaking the truth, if you look at actually the research on lying, we all lie all the time. Sometimes we don't know we're lying. Sometimes we do. Sometimes we tell what are called white lies because we don't want to hurt somebody's feelings. And, that makes sense. I mean, if somebody says, do you like this shirt? And you think, wow, that's a pretty ugly color. There's no point in really saying that unless you want to humiliate and hurt the other person. So the lying that is really probably most important is to trust that you speak words that are consistent pretty much with your integrity, with the way that you view things. And then when it comes to the other person, if their commitment is also to truth telling, then you don't have to be too paranoid when they tell you something. You can generally relax with it. So if somebody says, yeah, I was out because I was studying at the library, and they came in at 4 o'clock in the morning. If you generally trust what they're saying, you think, well, maybe the library was open later than what I thought. So I emphasize these kind of moral precepts because I think they give us as individuals a freedom to be at ease with ourselves. And then in our dyadic relationships, they give us a freedom to be at ease with language and also with simply not having to be too paranoid, not having to investigate all the time what the other person is doing and whether what they're doing makes sense. So that's sort of the foundation of trust is a kind of moral foundation, ethical foundation. And I could go on and on about that. I'll say just one other thing, that in my profession, which is psychology, I do have to take I make ethical promises. I have to take a test on ethics. And so when I practice psychology, it's grounded in ethical conditions and foundations. And I think that other professions should do that as well. So these days, a lot of us are talking about science and data, and scientists do not take ethical precepts. They do not promise, nor do they study ethics or tell us what they mean by truth. So it's harder to trust scientists because they don't have that ethical code than it would be to trust medical doctors talking about their profession or lawyers. Now, of course, everybody could break their codes, but taking a code actually puts you into a greater advantage, I think, of keeping the code than not taking any at all. So trust, is based a lot on that kind of ethic. Then in couples, trust is often broken initially because one or both people feel that the other party is not paying attention to the way that individual sees things, feels things, is speaking about things. And so what typically instigates an erosion of trust in a couple is not so much the lying, the cheating, and the stealing, although that's serious when that enters in, but more that sense of misattunement. Like you don't get me. You're not listening carefully. I've said this to you many times, but you don't seem to get it. And so that ability to witness the other person and to let them know by paraphrasing or by being curious that you are interested in what they're conveying gives a sense of trust to the relationship and an ease and a comfort. That's another thing about trust, is trust gives us ease and comfort. So when the when the sense of not being seen or heard or felt gets broken, often there is an experience of the trust being broken, even if there hasn't been any, cheating or lying or stealing going on in a dyad or a couple relationship. And again, I'm saying this broadly, but there are different kinds of things that occur in an adult child parent relationship, from a partnership relationship, and then from a friendship and so on. Different things might break the trust, but the fundamental ones have to do with those ethical foundations as well as the attunement issues. So I think I'm going to leave it at that. We've talked in other classes about certain aspects of being able to speak for yourself, listen mindfully, and how those contribute to accurate witnessing and being witnessed. But I think today we're going to be looking more at what breaks that foundation so that you no longer feel at ease. You no longer feel that you can retain that illusion that you're going to go on being together, or you no longer feel that you can really listen to the person's words and believe them. So those are breaks in trust. So I think I'm going to stop right now and see what you have to say, because this is a conversational class, and that will allow us to really get into the issues. We're talking about the breaking of trust right now. I'll be going into a little bit of the repairing of trust. And I'm open to taking other kinds of questions other than about couple relationship. If but again, I'm not talking about intimate relationship necessarily, but the kinds of relationships that where trust is important, and sometimes that can also be with groups that you work for, governments, religious organizations. All of these kind of rotate around the same issues of trust. So any questions about what trust is, or the breaking of trust, or any thoughts or anything?
I'm curious about the idea. I've noticed that there's a thing that somehow feels like it's related to trust, that really is a change in expectations, whether it's an organization or an individual. And I realize for me, when I've had that sense of not trusting the other in the way that I used to, there was something that changed in my expectations, or something that I expected that didn't happen. And as I worked through it, I realized that maybe my expectations weren't realistic. Can you talk about that kind of change in trust?
Yeah. I think that you're bringing in the issue really of the foundation between you and the other person. For example, if you have a committed relationship, if it's an intimate relationship, and if you've never talked together to establish whether both parties are committed to monogamy, for example, or if the other person has some different expectations of what a committed relationship is, you might not really have a contract or an agreement. And again, in many relationships that involve trust, there is a contract. Coming into therapy with me, I have basically a set of assumptions that I'm making about the way that people are going to come to the sessions, pay me, the confidentiality of it. I have certain things I have to say legally in terms of HIPAA and so on. And so I offer that as a contract, and we really don't enter into therapy until the other person has, with informed consent, agreed to that contract. Then I can, assume that they will follow these rules or whatever that I've set. But unless the other person and I have a pretty complete conversation about that, they might have expectations that, I can't meet, or I have expectations that they're not going to meet. And that, of course, we're talking about a professional relationship. But I think it's the same in a lot of situations. The two people go in, each with their own snow globe, to some sort of territory. And I think especially here, adult children and their parents often have breaks in trust because the parent has the expectation that the adult child is going to respect the parent, is going to be concerned about the parent, is going to actually care for the parent, simply because the parent has been the parent. But the adult child, particularly in North America, hasn't consented to that. And so sometimes there'll be breaks in trust because the parent is really hurt or even feels harmed by that adult child doing and saying certain things, but that the child doesn't even know it or has never agreed to that kind of contract, you might say. So, I mean, that's where I'm going with your question. I don't know if there's something more. It's like, you have to have a kind of agreement to have a foundation of trust.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then also, I'm thinking in terms of like in an individual relationship, an expectation of the roles, to be specific, and it's just an example, in a husband-wife partnership, and one partner is assumed to be the breadwinner, and then for various reasons that doesn't really work out so well. And
right.
it feels like a break in trust, but it's really beyond. It's not something intentional or volitional. It's just things change.
Things have
and
changed.
So then it's important, I think, for both individuals to sort of reconvene, reset expectations and roles and things like that. And then I'm also thinking in terms of organizations. I belonged to a church for a while, and I had certain expectations about how people would treat one another. And something happened where that wasn't honored the way I thought it should be.
Right.
And then I changed my expectations of what that organization was about and what I could reasonably expect from that group of people, from that institution.
So you're bringing up so many good questions, and I'm going to try to answer them in a sort of a summary way, because I think the most important answer is the issue of the contract that people have together. And that contract does change over time, like having a child that grows up and leaves home, and that's then done. And then they're coming back in as an adult, and you don't have a contract. It's no longer like, this is my house and you can't use the refrigerator kind of thing. You're on a different ground now. So renegotiating a new ground, and also recognizing that when you have an adult to adult relationship, both people are autonomous. Both people have to be respected as adults. And so you might assume, for example, that I know that I hear this a lot with couples. One person says, I just assume that two people who love each other are going to be kind to each other. Okay, that's not a contract. And also, kindness means different things to different people. And so it may take a while to negotiate just what person A means by I want kindness, and whether person B is willing to do that, and whether person B has a different idea about what kindness is. I mean, again, once you get into the snow globe world and you realize that there is no such thing as kindness, there are people who want to be treated kindly, people who come from different cultures and backgrounds, and there are many, many rules in many, many different situations about kindness. And so the idea that you might expect kindness is just an idea in your snow globe until you actually lay it out with somebody, negotiate it, talk about it, say what it is. You don't have that contract of how you're operating together. So in a sense, you don't have a trust. So you can't really break the trust because it's not the trust yet. You don't have that foundation. So that's a really good question. And I think that many times what I find that breaks down trust is that there's an assumption on the part of one person that an agreement has been made, but it hasn't been. And so then the other person's behavior is taken to be a break in trust. So good question. So so are there other questions? Again, we're on, good. And so that we're on breaks in trust right now and what trust is, and I'll go to mending trust and restoring trust and repairing it later. But I want to make sure we have an understanding of what breaking trust is.
Okay, there's a couple of other questions, not exactly on breaking trust, but per
Okay.
misattunement with couples, what if each partner grew up in such different cultures that their definition of trust is so different that they end up disappointing each other with some of the things that they do?
So that's, again, a really good question. Let's just assume that everybody has a different definition of trust. Even though we all might agree that it's something that makes us feel secure, like I said earlier, a place to stand, something that has the illusion of stability about it. But that, because we're all in these different snow globes where we see, hear, feel things differently, then what we each mean by trust needs to be investigated by anybody who wants to establish it with us. And so if you come from, again, in our culture, people get married from very different backgrounds. There are very few arranged marriages. So, if you were in India, you might have an arranged marriage with somebody who is from your social class, basically, has the same religious background, maybe wears the same kinds of clothes, maybe knows all of your daily rituals, so that there might be more of a apparently common understanding. Although I've also worked with Indian couples who've had arranged marriages, and they also have a big, they have snow globes too, so they'll have slippages between what one person means and another person means. But in North America, because we get together from such different tribes, we often have to investigate a lot before we have an agreement that, yes, we're going to share this, or we're going to be reciprocal in this area. And then that agreement or contract, and I really believe strongly that it's good to have policies, agreements, and contracts in all of your close relationships, so you don't have to invent the wheel every day, which is really tedious. But once you have some agreements, okay, you're going to do this and this and this, and this person's going to do that, then after time passes, you have to actually renegotiate those, because people age, their circumstances change, they lose their job, their relatives die. Lots of things happen to change circumstances that mean renegotiating. But certainly on issues that have to do with your differences in your tribe, and when I say tribe, I mean whatever group you identify with. Like, some people identify with their families of origin, some people identify with their religions, some people identify with their personal styles, some with their philosophies. And so whoever is your tribe, then you representing that kind of thing in your identity, you need to find out what the other person means by that idea. So I would not take for granted that ordinary words that deal with abstraction, like trust or self or truth, have a common meaning for any of us. I watched The Matrix last night because I'm going to be interviewing the psychologist, cognitive scientist Donald Hoffman, who wrote the book The Case Against Reality. And of course, he bases he bases his work on the idea that consciousness is the foundation, not the material world. We create the material world. Consciousness is what we come from. In other words, the brain tunes into consciousness. The brain doesn't generate consciousness. So, in the beginning of one of his chapters, he quotes the Matrix. There is no spoon, and I feel like that's where we need to go. We, as humans, we need to recognize there isn't a there that everybody gets. We have to keep on finding out, dialoguing, being curious, being interested. We come with that equipment to be compassionate and to be curious. When that breaks down, we need to use our skills, and the skills, of course, of speaking for yourself, listening mindfully, remaining curious, are the skills of real dialogue that I'm sure you're all working on, I'm working on all the time. So those allow us, of course, and I will be going into repairing trust in a minute. But are there other questions then that are on the chat right now, Lori?
There's one other one. How do you know if you should trust yourself to trust someone else? Question mark. Especially when someone has a tendency to either overtrust or to undertrust. So.
Well, I think that the really important part of that is, how do you know that you should trust yourself? I think that's important. And I think that's always a work in progress. So I feel like my trust of myself is based on several things. One of them is that I follow ethical precepts. So that's easy in a certain way, and I'm always interested in checking myself against those. And then the second thing is that I do check with other people to see if, I'm coming through on the things that I've promised to do, on the ways that I have agreed to act, or on the things that I believe that I'm saying. I check to find out, are they getting it? Does it make sense? And then that allows me to trust myself, because I can work with myself a little better if I find that when I'm saying something or I'm doing something, it's making sense to the other person. Then I feel like, okay, I'm proceeding in a way that I can trust. If that's not happening, then I have to be very careful. Then I have to be more careful to speak for myself, to listen really mindfully, to check out, did I get it? So I'm trusting myself on a moment-to-moment basis to be in contact with other people, as well as with my own snow globe, which is the seeing, hearing, feeling aspect of my experience, trying to be mindful of that. So over time, you want to check yourself by your results in your life. Like, are you moving towards the things that you want in your life? Do you know yourself well enough to know what you want? And if you've passed a few years here on Earth and you don't know that, well, that's a good place to start. You need to investigate why you don't know what you want in life, or who you want to be with. So trusting yourself, I feel, is something like befriending yourself, that you have to learn how to work with your own emotional experiences. You have to learn how to work with your words, your actions, in a way that you can always have some equanimity, some kind of matter-of-factness in working with yourself, some degree of clarity, and some degree of humility. Now, within all of that, you know that you are mostly unconscious. And so that you're not doing a perfect job of knowing yourself. But if you don't know at all about what you want or what you like or where you're going, no one else is going to be able to help with that. So you do have to actually find out. And I think within that self-inquiry, maybe one of the most important aspects is integrity, which is your ability to speak to yourself and promise yourself certain things, know what you're talking about, and follow through on those. Because that gives you, again, more trust in yourself. So I hope that was a helpful answer. That's a great question. How do you trust yourself? I think also if you don't trust yourself very much, it is hard to trust other people. I think a lot of times people ask me, if you don't love yourself, can you love other people? Yes, I think you can. But when it comes to trust, I think if you don't trust yourself, then you really don't trust your perceptions. And then you can't really trust the meanings you come up with. So then I think you can't trust what you hear from other people because you don't know how to measure it against anything. So the trust for yourself, I think, is foundational in trusting others or trusting anything. I think I'll move on then to repairing trust, unless there's something else. Is there anything else? No. Okay. So once trust is broken, now I have seen trust broken so badly that I don't think I personally could have trusted again, like working with couples. A lot of lying and cheating and stealing. It depends on your tolerance, for what you will tolerate. Maybe you tolerate more in your children than you would tolerate in your partner. Maybe you tolerate more from your parents than you would tolerate in your friends. But when a trust is really broken, then there has to be some time, considerable effort, time, whatever you want to call it, devoted to repairing it. And the way that you repair it is that the person who was harmed the most, or arguably feels most harmed, is the person who gets to speak first. And that person, in speaking for herself or himself, speaks in I statements, not you statements, not you did this and this, or you're just a liar. And all of those things are going to just evoke defensiveness on the other person, or humiliation, which leads to rage, and everything will just then go into repetitive cycles of polarization. So, when you're trying to repair trust, you speak in terms of, I've had this kind of experience, like I'm very hurt, I'm very worried, I'm concerned, I'm discouraged, I'm hopeless. I've spent so many hours worrying about you, and yet everything I say seems to go nowhere. You speak in terms of your own impressions, opinions, memories, desires, feelings, subjective experiences, not in terms of you or in terms of we. So beginning to repair trust, the more vulnerable, or the person who feels more harmed, is the first person to speak. And again, in a real dialogue format, you don't speak 36 pages before the other person says anything. You speak a certain amount, and then you stop, and the other person must paraphrase in a mindful listening way. And what that requires is the other person has to then step into the experience of the speaker and say, so I'm understanding that your experience was like this, that you felt these things, that these things happened to you. Did I get that? And then if the other person says, no, you didn't, then you have to try again and again and again until the other person says, you got it. And then the listener person in a repairing trust situation has to say, is there more? And then you go into the next thing in the next episode. And again, person who is the more vulnerable, speaking for herself, this is what it was like, and then there was this and this. That person also has the right to ask questions without, I think, adjudicating. I mean, this is a fine line, but if somebody has betrayed you, you have the right to say, did you spend $300 on tickets to Europe? Because I found that, did you go with him to Europe? and spend $300 on it. Was that where you were going? Those kinds of factual questions that have a common concern because, say, that other person's money was spent on this stuff. But the harmed person is not acting like judge and jury, like, so then what did you do after that? And what did you do after that? Again, that gets back into the you statements. So when the vulnerable person is speaking for herself, she has to stay within the framework of a general respect for the other, as well as lowering that sense of emotional threat. Or it won't be possible to repair the trust, because all you'll do is more and more polarization, more hurting, more harming, more battling, and there just won't be any repair of the trust. But if your actual desire is to repair the trust, again, vulnerable person speaks, other person paraphrases, asks questions, then there may be questions about circumstances, about evidence, about various aspects of what was taken advantage of. But it shouldn't seem like a court of law if you want to repair the trust. It should always be stated with respect. So the vulnerable person then eventually has spoken about her harm in her view. And at that point, she has to be able to ask the other person, or really be interested in, tell me about why you did that. Like, what was it? I mean, we have a trust, we have a relationship. What happened for you that you carried this thing out? And then the other person then has the chance to speak for herself or himself and say, well, this was going on and I no longer, believed you, or I was no longer able to invest myself in our relating, or whatever it is. That person who was motivated to do something that was breaking the trust then needs to talk about why. And then the person who feels most harmed has to understand, because there's no way to repair the trust if both people don't have some understanding about why it was broken and what the consequences were of breaking it. And so repairing trust takes a long time. I think that the general framework of truth and reconciliation that Nelson Mandela and Bishop Tutu brought on board is the general correct framework. That is, both people have to speak their truth, and there cannot be too much punishment of either person, or the trust can't be repaired. So, in repairing trust, if you create too many new damages, you can't repair the trust. So it's how do I want to say it? In any valuable relationship, to repair trust that's been broken requires recognizing each person is imperfect. Each person has limitations. Each person grew up in a family. Each person was traumatized by that family. Each person had emotional failures. Both people are unconscious. So it's a bootstrapping sort of thing. Now, if you cannot do that, you might want to break the trust and stop the relationship because you can't repair it. And then if it's a relationship of true, if you have a bond, if it's a parent-child relationship, or if it's a spousal relationship, or a long-time good sibling relationship or friendship, there will be grief in breaking that, and sometimes a lot of grief. And so if you're going to break it, it's a good idea to at least consider, is it more pain to repair the trust, or is it more pain to go through the grief? And again, that's where you have to trust yourself. You have to consult yourself. Nobody else can tell you that. So when you're repairing trust, there's a real concern for not damaging it more and for recognizing this is the way that, oh gosh, some psychoanalysts said it. I don't know if you, I don't, I mean, it was sort of, it was kind of, it revolves around Melanie Klein's idea of what's called the depressive position, which is that every human being is a specific being that is irreplaceable. And so when you recognize that you have a trust or a bond with someone who is irreplaceable, there will never be anyone like that person again in your life, that may give you a bigger framework in which to take that step by step and not damage the possibility of repairing by simply attacking and destroying and adjudicating the other person, just humiliating the other person again and again. Because you'll recognize that if you do that, you may destroy the bond completely. The person is irreplaceable. And I think here often also of adult children and parents that I've dealt with, particularly when the adult child is furious with the parent and wants to essentially attack and adjudicate the parent. And the adult child might not recognize my parent is a specific person who is irreplaceable in my life. There will never be someone like this again. And so can I tolerate my parents' limitations? Can I recognize my parent had a family and had limitations in that family and damages and so on? Can I open my own compassion to that so that I don't just attack and destroy and bomb out, at those moments when we're trying to repair trust? So that's kind of a long answer, but I'd like to hear now if there are questions or statements on the repairing of trust.
I have a question.
Yes.
Hi, Kelly, it's Devondria.
Oh, Devondria.
So hearing you say that about the trust, would you rather go through the grief or, tolerate the pain of rebuilding the trust? What if that other person doesn't want to go through it? Is there a way to develop space to start regaining the trust, to start healing from the grief, to rebuild the relationship, even if they're not interested in being a part of, say, the counseling session or, highlighting all the things that keep us in check with communication? What if they're not on board? How do you move forward because you want to keep the relationship?
Right. Well, it's one thing if it's a professional relationship. I mean, are you talking about that? Or are you talking about a personal relationship?
Personal. So say like the adult child, for instance, they're upset, the expectations, not being able to see the limitations of the parent. You, of course, want to stay in that relationship of the adult child, but they're not willing to go through the steps.
Right. Yeah, that's tough. I mean, I think that when there's that, so you've only got one party that actually wants to repair the trust. You can, I think, step by step attempt to regain trust with that person. And so you have to build a large vehicle for doing that. You may have to tolerate more betrayals or other things, or you might just have to, I know in my own life, I mean, sometimes I just want to repair things. And so I stop with the attempt to get an apology or to speak my truth. And I just go for the idea, I want a relationship with this person. And I'm willing to go forward even though they've hurt me badly. So I don't think we can ever cultivate in somebody else the desire to repair. We can offer the opportunity, but I don't think we can, really make somebody else want to repair. And I think with family members, especially, it can be difficult because the different perceptions that each person might have might never be ironed out, you know. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
And knowing that person in particular wants to just forget about whatever it was and just move forward, just kind of be willing to accept that and just
yeah,
go with it and not rehash what happened, because
yeah,
again, I think naturally we want to know for a couple of reasons. One, so we don't do it again. Two, so we
yeah.
have an idea of what went wrong.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, in the old style of being a parent, like in the style that my parents used, my father never talked about anything. I mean, either I accepted that we were going forward or I didn't. He wasn't going to talk about it. And so I think, there are people that we relate to, that we value, and we can't make the repairs that would allow us to truly deeply trust them again, but we can make enough of our own commitment to just go on and still be interested and still be compassionate, and that gives us the opportunity to know them, over time. I think that's what you're talking about, isn't it, Devon?
Yeah, you're right on. Thank you. That was perfect.
Okay, nice to hear from you.
You too.
So someone else asked, I guess there should be rules then about holding a grudge after things are cleared up and bringing it up again.
Oh, yes, there should be. Oh, yes. Yes, yes. That's it's a good question. Yeah. So, yeah, part of the repair contract is that you repair and then that is over. That is repaired and we don't do it again. And this is where I've had difficulties with couples around the affairs thing, where we've gone through the sessions. And usually in a dialogue therapy setup, it might be 2 sessions that we go through, maybe 3, repairing trust. And we do both sides, understanding the harm that was done, also understanding the reason for, the motivation for doing that. And we get to the end of it, and then, there's a closing wrap up. Now we're setting this aside, and you will never speak about this again because we have come to a conclusion. And then the next time the couple comes in, one person starts out with that thing again. And I think that as individuals, we may have not fully understood that the pain that we have from being hurt in a relationship where we've been betrayed becomes our pain after we repair the trust. We have to work with the pain ourselves. We have to then find a way to help ourselves. It could be spiritual practice, it could be prayer, it could be, handing it over to God or whatever. But there has to be a conclusion in repairing trust, because otherwise you just have the constant breaking again and again of that bond and the accusations and so on. So yes, there is a conclusion to repairing the trust, and then an agreement really needs to be there when you're going in to repair it, that you won't be talking about it again together. You might find some other ways of getting comfort. Again, the other thing that I don't recommend is when you're repairing trust, I don't recommend bringing in a lot of your own team to talk to about how the other person has betrayed you, because your team, whoever your team is, the people that support you, they're going to help you find evidence for how bad that other person is. And if you're really repairing the trust, you need to repair it with that individual, and then it needs to have a conclusion. And you need to think about how you speak about them then to your team. So all of those things are involved in truly repairing trust, because what you want to be able to get to in the repaired trust is trust. And in order to do that, you have to recognize the other person for their worth and respect them, and speak about them that way to your own team too. So yeah, when you bear a grudge, after you've repaired trust, it's your own issue to deal with that hurt and pain. So it's Margot.
I actually sent the question as well. So there's a question on my chat as well, but it's the same thing. And you may have answered this already, but it is, what if the person you want to repair the trust with, or you want to repair with, is dead? For example, a father who died when you were a teenager, before you had the maturity to understand his past and the reasons why he was harsh, unfair, a little bit beyond what, I mean, there's all sorts of things. Teenagers, of course, see their parents as being unfair and harsh regardless, but this would have been a little bit more than that, because it wouldn't have just been through teenagehood. It would have been an ongoing trauma with a little t, nothing major, but it did erode the trust to the point where when he died, there was no, it was like this person didn't care. I didn't care. But through the growth process and understanding, and also training as a therapist, realizing that there was a great deal of grief that hadn't been grieved, and a wanting to repair, but now the person is gone. And does that ever get sorted out? Anyway,
well, that's a really good question. And so from a Buddhist perspective, you can always speak to all the beings that are in your life, and you can do ceremonies for them. And, it's like what we call like the space-time continuum that we're on. We already know that it's not accurate. It's about, really, the physicists are saying we're about to give it up anyway, because it doesn't, the space-time continuum as we've set it up doesn't work for a lot of things that we know. So who knows exactly what life and death is, and if consciousness is the basis of a lot of what we're experiencing, or everything really that we're experiencing, then you don't know the exact relationship you have to the dead. So, I would always assume that I can speak to someone who is dead and say what I have to say. And I also offer various kinds of ceremonies and so on. So I would certainly do that with your father. And sometimes writing a letter is helpful, because it puts your experience in a form that you can also go back to and read and even change. And sometimes also just having a conversation that is a bit of a lengthy conversation in which you give yourself, I mean, there's something that some psychotherapists do it's called active imagination, where you kind of say something and then kind of listen to hear what the response is. I think that can happen with people that have died. I always have a little bit of concern about that, just because I don't know how much, you might be activating your own responses. So, but that's another thing that some people do, is active imagination. I think certainly speaking your part, writing a letter, offering prayers and ceremony, all those things are good. And then also just having a kind, compassionate, warm feeling towards that person, I think is helpful. So yes, I think after death, people can still repair.
Okay, thank you.
And the real advantage is that the other party won't be arguing with you about it. So the dead have a way of not arguing much with you anymore, which is a great relief. So So is there another question, Lori, before I know we're about at time, and I know you have some announcements. So if people, I can answer your questions. She will send them to me. Unless there's one, Lori, that you feel needs to be handled.
I don't have a question that is a
Okay.
short answer, so I think we should end here for today. But I did want to remind everyone that at this same time next week is sort of, I think, a continuation of this class. It's Parents and Adult Children. Why is it so difficult to get along, and how can you help? So I think that would be sort of a continuation of this conversation. And on Saturday at 11, we have Living Together Without Falling Apart. That's session 9. Remaining Curious. And that class, even though it's wrapping up, is available on the e-learning platform, and also you can buy individual recordings if you're interested in just one topic in the series. So that's all on Polly's website. And there's a couple of new classes coming up on 6/23. Save the date for this one at 11 o'clock. It's Real Dialogue for Opposing Sides, Ending Polarization. And I don't know, Polly, if you want to say a couple words about that before we sign off, but.
Okay, so I am going to be on a panel for the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. At that time, the panel will be conducted out of Europe, and I'll be there with 2 or 3 other people who are presenting things on climate change, and then we're going to, it's a 2-hour panel, and I'll be on for 12 minutes and each one of them for 12, and then conversations between us about using dialogue for opposing sides. And then the other announcement is that I will be doing a 2-hour long conversation with Donald Hoffman, the author of The Case Against Reality. And if you look on his website, you will see who he is. He's, I think what he has to say about cognitive science in this period of time is extraordinary. Sam Harris interviewed him in an interview called The Illusion of Reality. I will be emphasizing more some of the issues surrounding intersubjectivity, placebo effect, and what happens if we really take deeply the idea that there is no spoon. So then, where do we go from there in terms of these oppositions that we have, in terms of these polarizations and so on. So, I'm really looking forward to interviewing him, and I'll be doing some of these longer interviews as a part of my ongoing development of Real Dialogue for Opposing Sides. So thanks so much for being here, and it was a great conversation. I enjoyed it. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.